All set? Okay. I'm pleased to tell you that technical difficulties were not entirely my doing, other than putting some film clips into my presentation, some very short clips from some video material of a bygone era that I'm using under the fair use doctrine of copyright law and all that. They're all a minute or less or so, and there aren't that many of them. But they're videos that I wanted to share with you chiefly because I like them, and they are in fact in a way emblematic of the time period that they come from. As Jan told you, I first had an interaction with him and other people related with MUFON several years ago. In fact, they invited me at that time to do what I'm doing this morning. I begged off and got them another speaker who's frankly a much better speaker than I am, and that all went very well. This year I tried to help Jan recruit someone else to speak to you this morning about secret space programs. He declined because, as an update to what Jan told you about funding, funding is in fact now flowing into the area of serious advanced propulsion from serious sources, where up until very recently that was not the case. Indeed, the project on which I do research has been funded as a NIAC, National Innovative Advanced Concepts NASA program, phase 1 grant for Mach effects thrusters interstellar study. It's a it's an assessment activity to see whether or not these things can be made to work, and if so, how many of you will need, and so on and so forth. So there are real programs that are funding these sorts of things. A major aerospace corporation is also on the verge of putting serious money into this too, as indeed I'm speaking here today. So if something can be done, it'll get done, and it'll probably happen within the next, being pessimistic this morning, 5 to 10 years. If I were more optimistic, I'd say 2 or 3 years. So the topic for this talk, secret space programs, as far as I'm concerned, is in a sense a misnomer, because as Jan told you, what I do is white world stuff. It's done with transparency and so on. And many of the people who I know and work in this area do basically white world sorts of things. I know, of course, a lot of people who some allege to have black world contacts, some I suspect of being in the black world and all that. And what I would say to you about that before launching into my presentation is that there have been, and probably still are, secret space programs, and notice that there's a plural involved there, not one massive conspiracy, but several not so massive programs. It's what you would expect in an area like this. It's an area where it's, how should I put it, extremely high risk, very high payoff type of work. That is to say, the odds that anybody will be able to figure out how to do this stuff and actually get it to work are very nearly zero before the fact, at least. But if anybody can, the payoff is so great that you can't afford to ignore it. And that's, in fact, I take to be the reason why I've had glancing interactions with various representatives of various government and aerospace industry people over the last 40 years. So let me tell you a little bit about my take on what's going on and what has gone on, and you can evaluate it as you choose. I'm happy to tell you that it looks like we've figured out what the path is forward. And so whether or not those programs exist and whatever they may have done, there is a transparent path forward that's in fact being pursued by people who know what they're doing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. What I would say to you this morning is that the interstellar age is underway. You know, the question is, what was the dawn of the interstellar age, or has it even happened yet? And I would argue that whatever you may choose as a date for the beginning of the interstellar age, if it's more recent than a year or two or three ago, you've missed what's been going on even in the white world. This is a cover from Physics Today, published last spring, several months ago. Where are they? I'm sure that I don't have to tell you where that phrase comes from. It was Enrico Fermi who sprang it on several of his colleagues, all physicists, at lunch at Los Alamos in, I believe it was 1953. And his colleagues, as I say, he sprang it on them cold. They didn't know what he was talking about. He explained that if there were clever aliens out there and presumably had civilizations that exceeded in age our civilization, and were it actually possible to get around space-time quickly, they should have showed up and made themselves known to us already. And he was under the impression that that had not taken place. I expect, speaking to this audience, that many of you would say, well, yes, of course, they've showed up, and we're recording events of their stopping by and interacting at whatever level with us natives to this world. The cover is, in a sense, sort of a teaser. If you read the article that's associated with the cover, what you quickly discover is that what they really wanted to talk about was a straight mainstream physics, which is now mainstream, which 10 or 15 years ago would not have been mainstream. That is to say, the incidence of exoplanets, the likelihood that they are inhabited, and so on and so forth, but there's essentially nothing on visitations by aliens of cultures much older than ours. Next slide, please. Okay. When was the dawn of the interstellar age? Okay. Again. Depends on who you ask. Okay. You guys would probably say 1947, or many of you at least would probably say 1947. If you were part of the aerospace community and nominally associated with black projects, you might say Project Orion, about 1960. This is one where Freeman Dyson had the clever idea of dropping nuclear weapons out the back of your spacecraft, blasting them off and having a large shield at the back of your spacecraft, where when the nuclear weapon went off, it would ablate material from the shield, and that would drive the spacecraft forward. A conventional explosives version of this was in fact tested back in those days, and it was found to work. Okay? This is a British Interplanetary Society. They date from about the same time, late 50s, early 60s. Project Daedalus. This was a bunch of engineers who sat down and said, knowing what we know about science, how would you go about designing an interstellar spacecraft? And what they came up with was something along the lines of what you might expect, and these things are generally referred to as generation ships. They only make sense if they are enormous objects that carry vast quantities of fuel and literally thousands of people to create a human colony on whatever star system that it's headed for. Okay, pop culture, wait a second. Yeah, 1966, the advent of Star Trek and Star Wars and so on and so forth. Next one. Physics. If you ask a physicist who is open-minded about this stuff, they would probably tell you that the dawn of the interstellar age was at the time of the publication by Kip Thorne and his graduate students of papers, one in the American Journal of Physics and the other, a couple of papers in Physical Review Letters in 1988 and early 1989. Thorne, as probably many of you know, had been prompted to think about this by his friend Carl Sagan, who wrote a book called Contact, later made into a movie. And Sagan wanted a way to get the protagonist to the center of the galaxy and back in essentially no time. And to do this, he proposed to use a black hole. Thorne quickly disabused him of that black holes don't work, though work in black hole physics has fuzzed that up a bit in subsequent years, but it's probably still a pretty good idea not to build a black hole to try and do this. What Thorne did was he reverse engineered a preferred topic in certain circles, but this was an open, transparent reverse engineering process where he said, if you want to get around space-time quickly, what do you have to do? And his answer was, general relativity tells us if you want to do that, you have to be able to create a wormhole. A wormhole is a geometric space-time structure that can be opened between any two points, however distant in both space and time, and create a short throat between those two locations through which you can step through if it's really cleverly engineered, and gets the name of Stargate. A Stargate is just a very short throat wormhole. What Thorne discovered was that for wormholes to be, as he called them in an appendix to his first paper on this, absurdly benign, you have to create a negative rest mass object, spherical or cubical or what have you, with a rest mass of the planet Jupiter, that is to say, about 300 times the mass of the Earth, and it has to be constructed in a small object of a few tens of meters dimension at most, and this he regarded as preposterously difficult, physically impossible, and so he went on to talk about, well, gee, if you could do this, what would you run into? And the first thing you run into is time travel paradoxes, and so his subsequent papers were devoted to the study of time travel and time travel paradoxes. Okay. NASA. Thorne's paper got the NASA administrator, Daniel Goldin, cranked up in the mid-1990s, and he went around tasking the various NASA centers with getting serious about trying to figure out how to make wormholes. Let's try another one. NASA DARPA. That was in the mid-1990s. I'll say a little bit more about that. In about 2011, NASA had the director at NASA Ames Research Center up near San Francisco, a retired brigadier general in the Air Force, a fellow named Pete Worden, okay, got together with a friend of his in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and tried to create a social infrastructure that would support a long-term research project in how to do all of this stuff. They called it the 100-Year Starship Project, and they kicked it off. They had a $1.1 million to do this with. They spent $600,000 setting it up, and they gave $500,000 to Mae Jemison eventually. To do this with the 100-Year Starship Project, it is limping along, near death. It was not the right thing to do. Next one. NASA in 2016, that is to say last year, under the pressure from Congressman John Culberson, Houston, Republican, who is the chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee that controls NASA's budget, Culberson decided that NASA really needed to get serious about interstellar matters, and as I understand it, he held up one of their pet research projects and told them that whether they wanted it or not, they were going to get $1 million to start this out, and so on. And NASA, as I understand it, said to him, "Oh, we already have that program. It's called the National Innovative Advanced Concepts Project," okay? And that's our leading edge of all of this stuff. And in 2016, they had funded something called Project Starshot. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. But in 2016, they also approached us with the Mach Effects Project and said, "Gee guys, why don't you apply for a phase 1 grant? We'll even give you some pointers on how not to write your proposal." Okay, so they gave us some pointers on how not to write our proposal, and I'm not sure whether it was the pointers or the exigencies of national politics, in particular John Culberson, that was the effective action in this, but we got the phase 1 grant. Okay, phase 2 is much more problematic, I should say. Okay, next slide. Okay, who are the individuals who are involved with this? First one, NASA and DARPA. I'm not, no, I'll tell you in the case of NASA a couple of names, because these people deserve credit for taking risks on something that makes excellent sense, but is the sort of thing that gets conservatives and true skeptics, unlike me, who is only a pseudo-skeptic, you know, really bent out of shape, and they deserve credit for where credit is due. In NASA's case, the individuals involved are Ron Turner, who is a scientific consultant to the NIAC program, Jason Derleth, who is the administrator in charge of the NIAC program, and the person who's in charge generally of outward-looking human exploration projects, a fellow named Jay Falker. They are the people who you can count on, hopefully, for white world serious work in this area. In the case of DARPA, I will not tell you who they are, though they're not particularly secret. And by the way, I don't have a security clearance or anything like that. Okay, British Interplanetary Society. Breakthrough Foundation. The British Interplanetary Society has been in this for a very long time. And up until fairly recently, they, like some of the speakers who will follow me, and perhaps many of you, were pretty much convinced that zero-point energy was the way forward. In the last year or two, they have come to realize that that wasn't really right, that zero-point energy is not the way forward. If the zero-point energy that zero-pointers, as I call them, wish were there, it would curl the universe up into something about the size of a grapefruit, and we wouldn't be here talking about it. You know? And this has been known, by the way, for decades. This is not something new. They have not found a way around that argument, and there are other arguments for it too. So the British Interplanetary Society is now interested in doing this sort of thing. There's something called the Breakthrough Foundation. You remember that guy, Pete Worden, I told you about, who was the director of NASA Ames some years ago? He retired a few years ago after the failure of the 100-year Starship project and became the CEO of the Breakthrough Foundation. This is something funded by a guy named a Russian oligarch with lots of money named Yuri Milner, who I don't believe has any Trump connections, so he may still be funding this in some forward coming years. And Stephen Hawking is a scientific advisor to this project. You'll see in a moment what that has produced in terms of what they've done. The Breakthrough Foundation is that, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin. This is Hal Puthoff's operation. And Hal Puthoff is one of the persistent leaders of the zero-pointer view about all of this, and has been for many years, and his persistence and doggedness, as I mentioned to the press conference yesterday, is, in my opinion, truly admirable. It takes real persistence to get anything done in this business. Well, suffice it to say, Hal's a really nice guy, and he's a good physicist, and he's wrong about zero-point energy, but that's okay. Next one is Icarus Interstellar. This is an operation which spawned out of the Daedalus project and was created about 5 or 6 years ago. It's based, if I recall correctly, well, the president of Icarus Interstellar is in Anchorage, Alaska. And I think the vice president's over in Australia, but Richard Obasi is probably the main driving engine behind it, and he's in Houston, Texas. Okay. Institute for Interstellar Studies. This is an operation in Great Britain. It's led by Kelvin Long. He too was under the sway of zero-point energy until, I hope, fairly recently. My colleague Heidi Fern was at a meeting in New York that was sponsored in part by the Breakthrough Foundation and the Institute for Interstellar Studies, held at one of the CUNY campuses, the Tech campus in Brooklyn, and she went as a proselytizer for mock effects, okay? Tau Zero Foundation. Back in the 90s, as I'll mention, I've got a slide or two on it. I haven't modified this in a month or so, so if I get a little out of sync with the slides, please excuse me. Okay, the Tau Zero Foundation is Mark Millis's creation. Mark Millis was a person back in the 90s who was discovered by a good friend, John Cole, who was the head of advanced propulsion at NASA Marshall for many years. Cole found Millis, and Millis set up something called the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Program that was run out of NASA. Glenn used to be, well, anyway, next one. 100-Year Starship, that's the project that I told you about. The next slide is going to have the people that are involved with all these. The Chinese. It's become clear over the last 5 or 10 years that we're not the only people paying attention to this stuff, that the Chinese are active in it. Their activity, at least at the visible level at this point, consists mainly of testing something called the EM drive, which you've probably heard of, and I'll have a little more to say later. But if they're testing EM drives, they're probably looking at everything else too. And what exactly they're up to, we don't know. Next slide. People. Now, I've already talked about that. I've talked about that. Let's see. Kelvin Long. Next. Okay. Yes, Stephen Hawking, Pete Worden. Yes, okay. Eric Davis. Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis. A number of years ago, Eric Davis, who had been hired by, oh God, I'm blocking on his name, the motel magnate who's making inflatable satellites.
Bigelow.
Bob Bigelow, thank you. Bob Bigelow created something called the Discovery Science Operation, which was, interestingly enough, homed here in Las Vegas. And he hired Eric Davis as one of his physicists for this operation. Eric did a number of field investigations for Bigelow and all that. And as Eric put it, Bigelow, for that sort of thing, has about a 5-year attention span, and 5 years came up, and sure enough, Bigelow closed it all down. Eric landed on his feet, however, because friends interceded on his behalf, and he was appointed as senior staff physicist at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin. As I told you, this is Hal Puthoff's operation. And Eric continues to do very good work. He's really interested in wormholes and warp drives. He doesn't mess around with the stuff like space drives and things of that sort regarding them as not the solution for interstellar travel. And he's right about that. People aren't going to be going to the stars until people figure out how to make at least warp drives, and probably not until they figure out how to make wormholes. Okay, let's see, what do we have next? Oh, Icarus Interstellar. I've already told you about Richard Obasi. Institute, Kelvin Long, next one, Tau Zero, I've told you about them. Oh, Martin Tamar. Let me tell you about Martin Tamar. I met Martin back in 1998. In 1997, the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics project that Mark Millicent created after John Colgudham set up had a workshop that took place at NASA Glenn in the summer of 1997, and it was an invitation-only workshop. Zero-pointers were there in force, and they dominated the program. I was invited to do a poster, which was okay as far as I was concerned. And there were a whole bunch of other people who were invited to do posters, all the way from the truly crackpot to the reasonably serious, okay? It was everybody who was doing anything that could nominally be called advanced propulsion was invited to the workshop. And let's see. No. Martin, sorry, senior moment. Martin wanted to go to this workshop. At the time, he was a graduate student in the International Space University program. So he didn't ask me if I could intercede with Millis to get him an invitation to the workshop. He had a friend of his named Christophe Belval, who was an economist, not a physicist, to get in touch with me to see if I could intercede to get Martin placed at the workshop. I tried and failed. And in retrospect, actually, I'm sorry that's the case, because Martin's turned out to be one of the serious people in this business, and his seriousness has been recognized. He's now professor and director of an institute at the Technical University in Dresden, and does very, very good advanced propulsion experimental work to see whether or not there's anything out there. And I'll have something more to say about him in a few moments. Go ahead. Under Mae Jemison. Mae Jemison was probably a political appointment. She's a former astronaut and all that. And unfortunately in this business, that's a mistake. You really need somebody who's running whatever they're doing, who actually has been a part of the community of advanced propulsion so that they know what they're doing. If you walk into a job like this without that background, you're just asking for trouble because you don't find out the history and who talks to who about what and that sort of thing. Next slide. That's now. What about then? We're going to do a brief historical foray with my favorite film clips. Okay. 50s and early 60s. You're going to hear a lot about the 50s and early 60s from speakers other than me. I detect from the abstracts of the talks that follow mine. I will not say too much about that. I just want to give you a feeling for the flavor of the 50s and early 60s because quite apart from whether or not there were secret space programs, I would say probably there were, and probably they failed, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay, next slide. Those of you who are familiar with film, this is of course taken from the George Pal version of War of the Worlds. Came out in 1953, and we've even got a brief clip from it. We're not getting the audio. Okay, there's really neat audio behind this. Okay? And the guy's sitting there talking to the general who's saying, what is that, a flying craft? No, it's being levitated on tubes of magnetic flux, which is of course just BS. He didn't know what he was talking about. Tubes of magnetic flux don't do it. Next slide. And just in case you didn't get the message about evil aliens, it's followed by this one, which also is not nearly as good as when you have sound. Okay. They're just blasting the bejesus out of everything in sight. And if you were a just barely teenager when this first came out, as I was, this got your attention. Okay. Gee, that's neat. I wonder if we'll ever be able to do anything like that. And of course, if you were a just barely teenager, job prospects and career paths and all that were not even a faint thought, let alone a serious concern at the time. Okay. And I believe we got one more slide. And this is the slide. God, we can't get the audio up on this? There's some of the audio. All right, I'm going to have to tell you what the audio behind this slide, this film clip is. It's the opening scene from a film called Forbidden Planet. It came out in 1957, I believe it was. And the guy intones about how, at the end of the 21st century, men in rockets finally reached the moon, and then about 100 years later, hyperdrive was discovered, and the speed of light barrier was achieved, and then vastly succeeded, and so on. And the exploration and conquest of deep space was undertaken by human beings, okay? Now, what was really going on in the late 50s and early 60s? Well, that's captured, and don't try to read this because I've got the separate things out. Go on to the first one while I do the backup. A friend of mine, some years ago, shortly after getting his PhD at Caltech, wrote a book. Oh, they're going to work on the audio problem. That's good because I've got some clips from Independence Day, and you really need the audio for that. Okay, you're welcome to stay up here too, if it'll get the audio up. Okay, a friend of mine, a fellow named Dan Kennefick, brilliant gravitational physicist, got his PhD at Caltech in the late 1990s. He actually did 2 PhDs, one on gravitational radiation reaction with Kip Thorne, and another one on the history of gravity wave physics, which was subsequently published as a book called Traveling at the Speed of Thought, Einstein and Gravity Waves, or something like that. Kennefick had an eclectic interest in what people were doing and all that. And what he discovered was a fellow named Joshua Goldberg, who had been working with Peter Bergman at Syracuse in the 1950s, had been hired by the Air Force to work, surprise, surprise, at Wright Field during the summers on gravitational physics and general relativity. And this is what he had to say about Goldberg's experience. First one is, oh God, I'm not, this is about the military having good sense to get real physicists. The next slide is the next part of that thing. It looks like, Have we frozen up the slides in an attempt to get audio for the film clips? Okay. The next slide tells you about who ends up controlling the money and so on and so forth, and how the Air Force didn't really know what it was doing and things like that. And the last slide is a quote from Goldberg's essay on his experience at Wright Field doing this stuff. This was, by the way, the Air Force's secret space program at the time. And he tells you that since he actually knew what he was doing as far as the physics is concerned, that he saved the Air Force's salary many times over by telling them not to pursue various proposals that they received, alleging to be able to do wonderful stuff. Okay, next slide. 60s and early 70s. Okay, 60s and early 70s, I want to reinforce for you, was not an age. Made sound 2. This is the launch of Apollo 8, okay, which is truly stunning. The thing to keep in mind when we're talking about 60s, you've already gone beyond. The thing to keep in mind about 60s was that it was NASA's golden age, really NASA's golden age. Kennedy, early in the decade, famously passed NASA, putting men on the moon and back by the end of the decade. And NASA did it, using computers that had less memory than sound. You're going to get to see the launch of Apollo 8. I'll shut up. Feedback of some sort.
Vibration was so intense you couldn't see the.
How about if I... Will that help?
I thought we had during the launch. I was hoping that Frank Borman didn't have his hand on the abort controller. He even said he took his hand off and he'd rather die than make a false abort.
Many of you, I'm sure, you turned my mic off entirely. Good. We're still having technical difficulties, as you can see. Many of you, like me, lived through the 60s.
12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Sideways shaking was unbelievable. The vibration was so intense you couldn't see the instrument panel. I thought we'd had it during the launch. I was hoping that Frank Borman didn't have his hand on the abort controller. He even said he took his hand off and he'd rather die than make a false abort.
If you were a student in the 1960s and you were interested in space activities and things like that, this was a path that was open to you, the aerospace industry. Not trying to make flying saucers, but building rockets that would take people to the moon and back. Okay? It was NASA's golden age. It was NASA's golden age into the early 1970s. and then NASA went astray. And my personal observation on that is that NASA tried to corner the market on space activities, and so when it came to designing a launch vehicle and that sort of thing, they invented the space shuttle, which was supposed to be all things to all people. That was what was hoped at the time, and it became an enormously complex, exceedingly expensive project that couldn't get you beyond low Earth orbit. And it didn't succeed in keeping the Air Force, in particular, from retaining space capability and so on and so forth. Military rockets are routinely launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base and create contrails in the Southern California sky that people still enjoy, okay? But in the late 1960s, if you were a grad student, as I was then, you got to witness the creation of and dissemination of the Condon Committee report. And if you read it, what you discovered was that Condon, Edward Condon, professor of physics at the University of Colorado, who was the head of the project, hadn't bothered to read his own report and wrote a bunch of things in the report that are just flatly contradicted by stuff later in the report. In 1973, Carl Sagan and Thornton Page organized a AAAS section on extraterrestrials and UFOs and stuff like that. This was a time at which Sagan was creating the so-called SETI project, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. The report of that section was deeply negative. They did discover, however, one case study that was technically well supported, that had been discovered by a guy named James McDonald, who I probably don't tell you, I have to tell you who he was, okay? The fundamental physics group. In the early 70s, Elizabeth Rauscher and friends created in San Francisco, near Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories, where some of them worked, the fundamental physics group. This was a bunch of academics for the most part, or would-be academics, people. Basically, in the early 1970s, you may recall the oil crisis and economic disturbances and all that. And basically, the bottom fell out of the hiring market for physicists. And so a lot of people who had excellent credentials could not get academic appointments of the sort that they wanted. And so Rauscher and her friends created this group for study of the fundamentals, primarily of quantum mechanics. But these people also troubled themselves to find out about general relativity as well. And they went on as an informal group for a number of years. Some of them, many of them actually still speak to each other. If you work in this field, you're bound to attract the attention of some of these people, in particular a fellow named Jack Sarfati. And if he deems it reasonable, you find yourself on email distributions, sometimes more email distributions than you'd care to be on. But these people were talking about the sort of things related to advanced propulsion back in the 70s and the early 80s, okay? And as I say, as physicists, you should take them seriously, okay? These people are not what I would call amateurs. They know what they're doing, and so I won't say more about that, okay? The 80s and 90s. The 80s and 90s were basically a dry spell, the only thing that was going on at public visibility level in the 80s and early 90s was SETI. And that was Frank Drake and Carl Sagan and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. You know about that. Sagan, his book Contact, which stimulated Kip Thorne to do the thing on wormholes. And Alcubierre in 1994 published the warp drive metric, the 80s and 90s. What about secret space programs? Well, in pop culture, there was a lot of stuff about secret space programs. The X-Files was an enormous television success. Independence Day, the film, one of my favorites of all time. As a matter of fact, I've even got a couple of clips from, actually 4. We're going to get the first one. I'm going to probably shut me off so you get the audio.
Welcome to Earth. None of you did anything to prevent this. You were totally unprepared. Don't give me unprepared. Come on, George. It was what, in the 1950s or whatever, you had that spaceship.
Dad.
That thing that you found in New Mexico.
Dad.
Where was it?
Not spaceship.
Roswell, New Mexico, yeah. No, you had the spaceship and you had the bodies. They were all locked up in a bunker. Where was that? David, Area 51, right? Area 51. You know that?
Is the one that's most relevant. It's where the Secretary of Defense, when the President says, oh, there is no spaceship, there is no secret base, and so on and so forth, and the Secretary of Defense interrupts and says, sir, that's not entirely accurate. Oh, sorry about that. Now you can hear. It's where the secretary. Go ahead. I'll shut up again for a minute.
Tell my children. I love you very much. All right, you alien.
The problem is that this is creating a feedback loop with the audio being.
Just keep moving forward.
Keep moving forward. I've been told enough with the video clips. I'll tell you real quickly about the video clips. One is where the Secretary of Defense says to the President, who's telling the father of the hero, oh, there is no secret base or anything like that. And the Secretary of Defense says, well, sir, that's not entirely accurate. Okay? And the last one is about the dad of some kids, a recently sober crop duster pilot who is now flying an F-104 or what have you, and figures out how to bring down the aliens by flying his F-104 into their primary weapon, which of course destroys them and so on. Okay, and he's got some colorful language to go with it. Okay, so we'll forget the video clips. On to the next slide. What do we know, actually know is going on? Next slide. Okay, well, This time is a time of somebody who's probably familiar to you, a fellow named Bob Lazar, who alleged to have been engaged in a secret space project at Area 51, actually at Papoose Lake, P4 or something like that. As I'm sure you can imagine, there was a fair amount of skepticism about Lazar's claims, and what I can tell you about that is that a fellow who, not long after Lazar made his claims, a fellow showed up at Cal State Fullerton and got into the master's, then new master's program in physics at Cal State Fullerton, and after having been there for a semester or so, he came over to visit with me in my office in the history department, and we got into a discussion, and he brought up Area 51 and Lazar and so on. I relayed to him a certain skepticism about all of that, and eventually it turned out, the fellow's name is Tom Mahood, by the way. You can check this out on his website, theotherhand.org. Tom allowed us how he had been engaged in debunking Lazar and discovered that much of what Lazar had to say was not exactly accurate and so forth. So, not surprisingly, not too many people went off after Lazar and believing that what he had to say was right. This was a time that Dan Golden was the administrator of NASA. He's the one who insisted that the various NASA centers start working on exotic propulsion or advanced propulsion. He's the one who got John Cole ultimately to get Mark Millis to create the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Project. Next slide. And in 2001, before this got killed, when Golden retired or left as administrator of NASA, when George Bush was elected, not long after George Bush was elected, 2001, this was a cover of Popular Science. Warp speed gets real? Question mark. There was serious talk about that. The fellow who was the editor of Popular Science about a decade and a half later said, "Where's my warp drive?" And of course, his warp drive had not yet been created. This is a notice of Golden's retirement. He was noted for saying faster, better, cheaper, and certain failures got laid at his doorstep, allegedly because the cheaper involved not doing things the platinum-plated way that NASA had become accustomed to after the Apollo project. Why now? Well, what's going on in the white world in the area of advanced propulsion is things have been winnowed down to two, actually really, in a sense, only one high visibility public project. This is a so-called EM drive. What's that? Roger Scheuer, who in 2002 proposed that if you took a conical resonant cavity and you pumped microwaves into it, you could make it move because it was conical in shape and presumably the interactions at one end were bigger than the interactions at the other end, and as a result, the thing would move in the direction of the larger interactions. That's a picture of one of Scheuer's EM drives. This was built by a good personal friend of mine, actually, a fellow named Paul March, who was working for a fellow named Sonny White at NASA Johnson. Sonny had convinced his local management that they should put some money, at least a small amount of money, into more advanced propulsion type of work and so on. And Paul was always a fan of Scheuer's EM drive. Sonny was more interested in warp drives and was using something called Mach-Lorentz thrusters as a way of trying to distort space-time. Okay, that's Sonny giving a lecture on this stuff. This is a recent cover from Aerospace America, fuel-free drive. EM drives, at least in the popular view, are the way forward. And as I said to the reporters present at the press conference yesterday, you can actually watch this on TV. The next show is next Wednesday night. It's a show on CBS called Salvation, and they are using as the central plot device the creation of working EM drives as the way forward. The problem with well, there's a problem with them. Next slide. Okay, let me see. Oh, God. Oh. Yeah. There's certain skepticism about EM drives. Try the next slide. Let's see what it is. Suffice it to say, EM drives in the terms preferred won't work. Okay. Project Starshot. A year and a half ago, NASA's NIAC program identified this project as the way forward for interstellar missions. The Breakthrough Foundation, the thing headed by Pete Worden up in San Jose, is the one following up on this. And it made the cover of Scientific American within the last year. What these things are is nano-solar sail satellites, or nano-sail satellites, or starships, actually. They are chips mounted on little miniature sail-type arrangements, and what you do is you make vast numbers of them and then blast them in the direction you want to go with high-powered lasers. You make enough of them so that you can lose a lot of them on the way, and so on. Okay. When this was announced a year ago, it was to great press fanfare and all that, and Freeman Dyson, who is a consultant to the Breakthrough Foundation, was asked what he thought of Starshot, and he said, well, it's silly, okay, and so on. Okay. This is his closing comment, and the thing to take away from this is he says it's a robotic way of doing serious exploration, but I'd still like to go. That is to say, notwithstanding Starshot, he'd really like to find a way to get around space-time quickly. Okay, what I'm going to talk about, and briefly, let me see how much time we've got here. Clear of the light. Okay, I will go through this as quickly as I can, which is going to be quickly. Mach effects. What? Okay. This is the Exotic Propulsion Initiative of the Space Studies Institute in Mojave, California, the president of which is a fellow named Gary Hudson, who I met at a STAFE, Space Technology Applications International Forum meeting back in 2007. Gary was interested in exotic propulsion and all that, and some years ago, in conjunction with Gary and his organization, they set up the Exotic Propulsion Initiative, the main object of which is Mach effects, okay? And this has only made it to the popular press at the level of that New Scientist cover article, which is for the most part not about exotic propulsion. It's about what's going on at CERN, or what isn't going on at CERN. Anyway, there was a sidebar to this article, and this is one of the amplified parts of that sidebar, where they tell you that exotic propulsion probably involves general relativity, and that it's a mystery that gravitational and inertial mass turn out in general relativity to be the same thing. Actually, that's wrong. It is not a mystery that gravitational and inertial mass turn out to be the same thing. The reason why is inertia, this very large effect. You push on something, it pushes back on you, even if it's out there loose in free space. You push on it, it pushes back. That force that you feel pushing back is the gravitational action of the rest of the matter in the universe. And there are some subtleties, which are not widely appreciated yet anyway, about how that works, but it is in fact contained in general relativity. And it's also a fact that Einstein understood this. From the time he invented the equivalence principle in 1907 through his death, okay? So do not believe people if they tell you general relativity doesn't have anything to do with this, because it's curvature effects, which are utterly minuscule and unimportant and all that. Inertial effects are gravitational effects, and they are gigantic. And it's when that's understood that you've got a chance, okay? This is more, the person who wrote the article had interviewed Martin Tamar. You remember the fellow who tried to get Christophe Belval to get me to get Mark Millis to invite him to PPP workshop. It turns out that the Estes Park conference that Jan told you about at the outset was when Martin sprang on the conference what I think he had expected to be negative news about Mach effects. It turns out that I had given him a device of the sort presently being tested in several labs worldwide back in 2000. And he had kept it all these years. And a year ago, he set his graduate students to showing that it didn't work. And surprise of all surprises, he discovered that it did work. And he literally, at the time as the conference was going on, his graduate students were revealing the signals that he was getting at the time. This is what convinced the people in NASA that they should think seriously about giving us some money and the NIAC Phase 1 award. There's another one that Martin was testing. Martin tests everything, and most of it doesn't, well, almost all of it, save for Mach effects, have not worked. Okay. What about the quantum vacuum? You've heard me say that the quantum vacuum does not work for propulsion purposes. This was published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. Heidi Fern and I, the lead article in last fall's issue of that. This past spring there was an experimental one, and so on. What are Mach effects? Next one. Gravitationally induced rest mass fluctuations in accelerating extended bodies undergoing changes in their internal energy. And that's a real mouthful, okay? It turns out that the way in which all of this stuff gets implemented is a consequence of a gravitational effect that is produced when you push on something if it's squishy. That is to say, if it does not accelerate rigidly as you push on it, and it's absorbing internal energy. It's being compressed, okay? That, combined with the acceleration, is sufficient to produce a gravitational effect that changes the effective rest mass of the object. And the change is 15 orders of magnitude larger than the sort of effects that you would expect from normal gravitational types of effects. And it's all straightforward math. It's all real physics. There's no hand waving, nothing up the sleeve. And I wore a long sleeve shirt today, so I could do that, okay? It's, for that reason, of course, it's not very sexy. And as a result, it does not have the following that 0-point fluctuations of the quantum vacuum do, which sounds really neat, okay? But it's wrong. Mach effect thrusters, the way in which you implement this is with devices like that. The longitudinal section drawing is from 2000 or thereabouts for the thruster that Martin Tamar was testing in his lab and still has. That's a picture of a more recent one. Next slide. Oh, okay. The Nembo Boldrini, who has been involved with this for many years, put together this animation to illustrate how it works. Press the button. Notice the fluctuating mass, the color is changing. That indicates a fluctuation in the rest mass. There's an actuator between the two, and if You push when it's more massive and pull back when it's less massive, you generate a steady thrust. That's how these things work, and presumably people will be using them in space sometime soon. If you want to test for these, you have to create something called a thrust balance. You have to be able to see these effects, which are still very small. They're on the order of a few micronewtons at most. You need to have a torsion balance. That's what one of those looks like. And I'll leave it up long enough for you to go back so they can read the caption. All right, well, read the caption on. There we go. Okay. You have 15 seconds to read the caption. Time's up. This is what one of these things look like. I'm sure that most of you are not interested in the technical details of these things, but they're important, because if you don't get all of this stuff right and do it in such a way that other people can try and pull it apart, you won't succeed. Okay, next slide. That's what one of these things look like. That's one being installed on the end of the thrust balance. This is in a Faraday cage, and that's in the vacuum chamber that this thing runs in. And I'm going to tell you about the green stuffed animal in the foreground. Many years ago, I heard a talk by a historian of 17th century chemistry, and she allowed that all self-respecting alchemists had stuffed crocodiles hung over their hearths where they did their work. And I thought that was so neat that when I got home, I told my significant other, Carol, I said, gee, I've got to get a stuffed crocodile to hang over the vacuum chamber in the lab. And she knew I was serious. So the next day she went down to Toys R Us and got the mascot for the experimental program, who I refer to lovingly as Croc. Okay, next. Okay. These are the sort of results you get. The red trace is the thrust traced. This is 2 8-second pulses at constant frequency. And as you can see, the power pulses, the blue is the power pulses are accompanied by an offset of the red trace below the center line, which is the black line there. There are also very prominent switching transients. It turns out that the switching transients are almost certainly the things that will be implemented to make practical devices and make this work. And it turns out, oddly enough, that there's some evidence in the sort of literature that you read to suggest that that's actually the way these things work, at least in one case. Okay, color coding. Okay, next slide. As I say, I'm not going to perpetrate too much tech stuff on you in heavy doses. There's a set of switching transients. When we first paid close attention to the switching transients about a year ago, Gary Hudson, the president of the SSI, who was a sponsor of the workshop in Estes Park last year, happened to be by, and he watched one of these events take place, and he said, gee, can you make more of them? And I said, we don't have the computer code to do that yet. And he said, you really need to make more of them. I said, okay, we'll see what we can do. He said, I'll be back in a few days. So in a few days, I sat down and rewrote the quick basic code that controls the experiment to produce these things. And he looked at him and he said, oh, that's a space drive. Okay, and indeed, probably it is. Okay, all right. I'll give you 10 seconds to read this one. Time's up. 2 pretty runs. These are the most color coding again. Okay, next slide. Okay, that one was an accident. I had not set the frequency properly, And so the first two chirps, as they're called, are not particularly good. And then I changed the frequency and overshot and produced really nifty stuff in the last two chirps. And there are technical reasons why they're pretty. The next slide, no, back to the previous one. That slide is prettiest one we produced so far. That's really serious stuff. This is reality. This is not, oh, I heard this story or somebody told me or something like that. If you come and visit our lab at Cal State Fullerton, we've still got the device that did this, and we of course have been running it into the ground, so it doesn't produce quite as pretty plots as these as it used to, but it still produces the plots. And we'll be happy to show them to you, okay? That's inverting it to show that when you reverse the direction of the thrust changes as it should. It's a way of getting rid of spurious signals, okay? What about secret space programs? No, all right. No, next slide, but not the next one. As I said, I've had a lot of glancing interactions with people in the government. I've met a lot of people, most of them decent, well, pretty much all but one or two, at least, of them honest, decent, upright people. Some of them are involved in the black projects that following speakers will try to tell you that they know about, and so on. My experience with all of those folks leads me to believe that while it's been the ardent desire of people in the government and major aerospace corporations to find a way to create space drives, and better yet, warp drives, and even better than that, wormhole generators, that the way was not found until the early 1990s, and the way was not found in the white world until the last few years. That there have not been secret space programs where folks were communicating with people who allegedly, or critters who allegedly knew how to do this stuff, and they were intimating to them the physics that you need to know to do this. The physics is not obvious. It's conventional physics. You don't have to believe in some unified field theory or some new force or the quantum vacuum. You don't have to take any of that stuff seriously. All you have to do is understand general relativity as Einstein intended that it be understood. And then you have to be fabulously lucky and blunder onto stuff that is really not that difficult. If I could blunder onto it and recognize it for what it was, it can't possibly be that difficult because I'm not that smart, okay? So my advice to you is enjoy the following talks, but be a skeptic, okay? Ask the people if they're really serious and they really do have a lead on to real programs. They will be able to tell you the physics of how it works. The one thing that you cannot make up in this business is the physics. That's not a matter of personal belief or wishful thinking or anything like that. It's either right or it's wrong. And if it's right, it will work. And if it's wrong, it won't. And if the folks tell you, oh, the secret space program exists, but, oh, the physics, well, I don't know about that. Well, if it did, if the program exists and the person telling you about it were really tracking something like that, they would know about the physics. So watch out. The interstellar age is upon us because it's being done in the white world, okay? And so you don't need to believe stories about the black world if you don't want to anymore. Okay, the best evidence I've ever seen for the type of black project that we're talking about actually appeared in 1990, which was before this was the physics was actually understood. Book by a fellow named Blum called Out There, which you'll probably recognize as the theme of the X-Files. And I've reproduced from the latter part of that book a couple of pages. Read the bottom paragraph here. It's a story about the UFO Working Group, a group of scientists drawn from various agencies who were supposed to find out what's what about black projects, because the people in the government wondered whether or not there was some conspiracy going on like is intimated in the X-Files. And this is one of the last meetings of the UFO Working Group, and the last paragraph and the next slide are the best evidence for real black projects, in my opinion. You can just leave the slide up. Okay, that's what I've got to say to you about all this stuff. Think positively. The interstellar age is upon us. Okay, people will be building space drives sometime in the fairly near future. If they haven't already, they'll be building warp drives and wormhole generators, I would guess, within a decade or two at most. I won't live to see them, but most of you probably will. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That's all right. That's all right. Let's give him another hand of applause. He's made a great effort to be here with us today, and we really appreciate that.
Okay, I'll answer questions. Do you want to leave? Do you want a few questions?
Let me. Do you want questions? Okay.